The constraint in artificial intelligence is not only talent or capital, but the physical availability of compute and power. Executives across the industry now describe a grid-level choke point. Data centers have the chips, but they cannot always switch them on. In a recent interview, the head of Microsoft said plainly that electricity is the limiting factor, a statement that reframes artificial intelligence from a software narrative into one about hardware, energy, and industrial policy. The consequences for hiring are immediate. Firms budget for engineers and product managers, then stagger headcount against quotas of available accelerators and megawatts. The pipeline of roles follows the pipeline of power. This present tension caps a long arc. In the early 2000s, artificial intelligence was a research specialty, and graphics processors were for rendering. By the early 2010s, breakthroughs in deep learning turned graphics chips into the engine room for training neural networks at scale. A decade later, the rise of foundation models concentrated demand in a single supply chain. Accelerators from one dominant vendor, fabrication at leading-edge foundries, and hyperscale clouds to host it all. The market data tells the story with unusual clarity. In late fiscal 2025, Nvidia reported quarterly revenue above $39 billion, driven largely by data center demand. In the labor market, job postings referencing artificial intelligence skills rose into the high single digits as a share of listings in information and communications roles. According to a national analysis of postings data, together these figures show how compute economics set the tempo of organizational hiring plans. The adoption signal inside firms is broad. Surveys from established consultancies captured the moment when generative tools moved from pilot to practice. In 2023, McKinsey reported that a meaningful share of organizations had already embedded generative systems into at least one business function and expected to increase spending accordingly. The directional lesson was that management teams would restructure workflows around models if compute, budgets, and risk tolerances allowed. Hiring then follows use. As functions adopt models, leaders add roles in data engineering, model monitoring, product analytics, and domain-specific prompt and retrieval work. Where compute is scarce, they sequence adoption, delaying teams until capacity frees up. The growth arc across decades is visible in 3 steps. First, the 2010s brought algorithmic breakthroughs and cheap cloud storage, setting the preconditions for data-hungry systems. Second, the late 2010s and early 2020s added scale and commercial use cases, expanding the hiring footprint beyond research. Third, the early 2020s tightened the loop between hardware and labor. The price and availability of accelerators began to shape which business lines staffed up and which waited. Price signals confirm a gradual easing from the peak of scarcity. Cloud rental rates for flagship accelerators fell sharply from their highs in late 2024, yet remain significant enough that enterprises still gate access, prioritize inference efficiency work, and cluster model training into scheduled windows. The capital and operational costs now decide which functions hire first. Teams that can prove inference cost reductions, latency gains, or higher utilization win headcount in a constrained environment. The bottleneck is not only chips, it is square footage, transformers, interconnect, and megawatts. Utilities and hyperscalers are negotiating demand response agreements that throttle usage during grid stress, confirming that power availability has become a strategic variable in product roadmaps and talent plans. When a region cannot deliver stable megawatts, firms slow deployments and delay hiring tied to those deployments. The same dynamic appears in the insurance and construction markets for data centers, where reports describe rapid growth coupled with grid, permitting, and supply chain frictions. Companies now recruit energy analysts and site selection specialists alongside machine learning engineers, because siting decisions determine whether teams can run workloads on time. At the policy edge, international organizations have updated the risk picture. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development estimates that a substantial share of jobs across member countries contain task bundles at higher risk of automation, concentrated among lower-skilled roles. The World Economic Forum's employer surveys point to simultaneous job creation and job destruction over a 5-year horizon, implying churn rather than simple contraction. In the United States, the labor force participation rate recovered from its pandemic trough, but remains sensitive to demographics and sectoral shifts. Taken together, these sources reinforce a structural truth. Technology reallocates tasks faster than institutions reallocate training, and participation rates respond with a lag. Why the GPU economy now shapes hiring is best explained through incentives. Training large models requires clusters of accelerators with high bandwidth memory, fast networking, and reliable power. When the price of an hour on a leading accelerator falls, firms move forward hiring for roles that assume regular access. Research scientists, data engineers for high-throughput pipelines, and applied teams building internal copilots. When that price rises or power is constrained, firms hire differently. Optimization engineers who can compress models, inference specialists who shift workloads to cheaper silicon, and platform teams that prioritize caching, distillation, and retrieval-augmented designs to reduce token and parameter counts. The availability of alternative chips matters here. Proprietary inference silicon from major clouds adds supply at lower cost per token served, allowing some product teams to decouple their hiring cadence from the most constrained accelerators. The firm-level strategy is now visible in earnings and roadmaps. Compute-heavy companies continue to invest in data center expansion, but they also signal new priorities: power procurement, grid partnerships, and efficiency targets. Analysts and executives have begun to talk about megawatt hours per model milestone, a metric that did not exist in the earlier era. Media and research commentary has highlighted the industrial nature of the transition. Machine learning at scale behaves like heavy industry, with step function jumps in energy draw during training cycles and a persistent baseload during inference. For hiring, that means an increase in roles at the intersection of software and operations, capacity planning, workload scheduling, and cost accounting for tokens and kilowatt hours. The human consequences cut across occupation, region, and credential. White-collar roles with repetitive synthesis tasks see the highest exposure to augmentation, not necessarily displacement. Blue-collar roles tied to installation, maintenance, and physical infrastructure see steady demand as data center construction accelerates and advanced manufacturing expands. Urban markets with research universities and cloud regions accumulate higher shares of postings that require artificial intelligence skills, but mid-market metros have begun to rise in the rankings as new facilities come online. The gains accrue to workers who can translate between domains: a nurse who can use clinical decision support tools, a claims analyst who can audit model outputs, a software engineer who can prove a percentage drop in inference cost at constant quality. Losses concentrate where tasks are routine and training pipelines are weak. Wage effects are uneven. In occupations that blend software with domain expertise, employers report readiness to pay premiums tied to provable productivity gains. In support roles where generative tools absorb drafting, summarization, or basic analysis, the premium compresses unless the worker manages workflows or quality assurance at scale. Surveys suggest that as more functions adopt generative systems, firms re-weight compensation toward roles that move model-assisted work into production with reliability guarantees. In parallel, entry-level ladders in some corporate tracks become narrower as tasks that once trained juniors are automated, shifting early career hiring toward fewer, higher skill positions and more short-term contracts aligned to model deployment cycles. Education and training institutions are adapting incrementally. Employer surveys from the past 2 years show sustained demand for analytical skills, data literacy, and model governance, yet the curricular response is still lumpy. Traditional degrees remain valuable when paired with demonstrable skills in data handling and tooling, but the fastest signals come from industry certificates anchored to specific stacks and compliance frameworks. On the supply side, a rising share of postings explicitly mention artificial intelligence literacy or model monitoring familiarity, while listings in sectors such as construction and health show slower adoption of such requirements, indicating a staggered diffusion across the economy. This diffusion curve suggests a multi-year window in which institutions can realign programs toward measurement, auditing, and human-in-the-loop design. The causal forces are not limited to technology. Globalization shapes access to fabrication, components, and specialized labor, Venture capital preferences influence whether firms fund compute-intensive strategies or chase inference-heavy applications with faster payback. Regulation sets floors for safety and reporting, changing the mix of compliance and governance roles on teams. Supply chain concentration magnifies shocks. A delay in advanced fabrication or a pause in a hyperscale build can ripple into hiring freezes in businesses that depend on scheduled model improvements. Industry commentary has documented periods when companies paused artificial intelligence hiring to reprice projects against newly scarce compute, then resumed as capacity returned. The cadence of hiring thus mirrors the cadence of cluster deployments. Where this leads over the next decade is already sketched by forecasts. Global employer surveys anticipate net job churn with significant reconfiguration of skills, not a uniform contraction of work. Productivity estimates remain wide, but even the conservative cases imply gains if organizations manage transitions. In the United States, participation rates will be shaped by demographics and the effectiveness of reskilling, while the availability of power and the cost of inference will shape where firms place teams. As cloud providers roll out lower-cost inference silicon, and as rental rates for top-tier accelerators stabilize, enterprises will expand hiring beyond the core technology hubs into regions with power, land, and fiber. The winners will be organizations that treat compute as a scarce input to be optimized and labor as a portfolio of skills to be continuously reconfigured. The policy implications are practical. Grid upgrades, transmission build-out, and streamlined permitting for data center campuses determine where high-skilled jobs cluster. Education systems that focus on measurement, statistics, and systems thinking will supply workers who can operate in model-mediated environments. Public labor data that tracks task content with greater granularity will help regional planners anticipate which occupations are exposed and which can expand. In a decade defined by a tight link between kilowatt hours and hiring plans, adaptation will look industrial rather than rhetorical. Consistent investment in power, silicon, and skills, and a steady expansion of roles that convert compute into productive work. The story of work will be written not only in code, but in capacity factors, utilization curves, and the discipline of making scarce resources yield measurable output.